that is doing everything.
Right. Now, this is a very important point, that we don't want through our programs to force economically this, agglomeration, amalgamation of operations if we can avoid it. And is that an area that where we may have promise for implementation of cost and compliance improvement in encouraging cooperative work between, in terms of implementing infrastructure?
Programs like
coalitions and stuff.
Programs like the EQIP program are tremendous to help those kinds of situations where something is not cost effective to implement, where you have a 50% cost share. And I've been very pleased in some of the other forums that I'm involved in to see many of my friends in the environmental community and environmental justice community start to, not all of them, but many of them start to understand the importance of programs like the EQIP program that comes out of USDA and NRCS to help move things forward that otherwise would not, that people would like to put in place but they can't afford to.
This is good. I'll wrap up. I'll probably echo this comment to the other folks because we want to hear from every sector. But I want to remind everyone, in terms of the standard I believe our staff has set forth about disclosure and transparency. In our resource alignment report, I believe we've created a template for you all, and I encourage you to refer to it and how we present information to try to disclose the costs in the context of overall expenditure. And I know that there's going to be trade secrets, et cetera, and economic advantage and disadvantage that we want to be sensitive to, but ultimately I think this exercise will be more productive for us state water board members if we move toward disclosure and context of expenditures. And this is and I believe that we've put our foot forward in terms of disclosing our expenditures. And for instance, there's this one, it's very simple graphic, but on page 22 of our resource alignment report, we have a pie. And it says, where does $100 of the NPDES money go to in our program? And I'm interested in the pie. I love pie. It's the best part of the dinner meal. But aside from that, it's just getting us a sense of what is the cost of compliance in the range. I'm very humbled and respect the diversity of the agricultural community in this state. But to get our arms around, in these programs, where is compliance costs really turning into a sizable piece of the pie? And then in which programs is it not? And what can we learn from that? And what are the reasons for that? So I just wanted to encourage that sort of disclosure to give us context with cost.
One last comment along those lines. The single largest cost for, I believe, all of the water quality coalitions in the Central Valley is the monitoring and analysis piece. That, I think, if you look at their budgets, that is the largest single component of their budgets. And with the groundwater component coming in, that's why you're seeing them start to double their per acre rates because of the costs associated with that piece.
Good. That's good information, and that's something we'll want to learn more about. Thank you.
Before we move on to Bobby, who's waiting so patiently, two quick responses to things that Danny said. One of your comment, I think, really got my attention, and I would encourage you to not just you, Danny, but the other groups too, to look into further expanding the idea of economic analysis tools, how those tools can be developed, used to the extent consistently possible in our various programs and various regulatory efforts. And then building on to what Steve just said, and also with this implementation plan idea, a suggestion for you as you are moving along in this effort, developing your recommendations, your cost data, as one of the things I would love to see in the report that is submitted to us is your estimates of the reduction in cost of compliance that would be achieved through the recommendations that you provide. And so once we have the recommendations and as we start thinking about implementation, one of the things I would suggest to us is we adopt some kind of target with respect to reduction in cost of compliance. I think it's a way to give some measurable measures with respect to this effort. And, you know, obviously a lot still needs to be worked out in terms of the specific recommendations, what can actually be implemented, and the timeline for that. But I would like for all of us to keep that in the back of our mind so that this is not just a theoretical exercise, but to keep in mind that the goal here is to reduce those costs and hopefully to put some kind of target, some performance measures in place in terms of what we can accomplish in those actual reductions.
And I would just add to that, and this definitely applies to everybody. In addition to what your recommendations are going to offer in terms of reducing or making things more efficient, identifying those places where by kind of enlarging your view gives some benefits that might not be water quality benefits. And Danny mentioned one, which was energy efficiency or GHG reduction, because that may be an opportunity for getting coverage for costs from other sources. And productivity, you know, what kind of, for ag, it would be productivity. Also integrated regional water management, water supply benefits that might be coming from some of the things that you're doing, which could also open up the possibility for additional funding or you know, benefits that others would pay for. So I think that's, as we look at this, we will be focused on the water quality piece, but there are many opportunities that are bigger, and we want to take those into account as well.
It's true. You know, what I struggle with this exercise is to consider our requirements in complete isolation isn't really a valid way of assessing cost. But we can get out of, you know, out of control as far as the big picture and everything. So we have a limited amount of time. We need to winnow it down, but we want to recognize those dynamics. Thank you.
Bobby.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, members of the board. I'm Bobby Larson. I'm with the California Association of Sanitation Agencies. I'm here today representing the MPDS stakeholders, and in particular a subgroup of public wastewater agencies that has been convened that involves the regional associations that you're familiar with, as well as CASA and TriTac. We have convened our work group twice and have another meeting/conference call scheduled for the 29th. So we have had some very productive discussions with regard to the resource realignment. We have actually developed 10 proposals at this point for specific reforms that would reduce the cost of compliance on publicly owned treatment works. We do need to do a little bit of additional work on them. We want to do some filtering and some prioritization, and also some hard questioning of ourselves as to whether we want to advance all 10 of these at this point in time or not. Some of them are quite ambitious. We also want to try to look at them from a perspective of whether they are going to be seen in the same way by other stakeholders and by the staff as far as things that are worth doing here in this first phase. But we do expect to have, around 8 proposals to bring forward. We do need to share these with our colleagues in the larger MPDS group who've been doing some work as well. So we've kind of proceeded along some parallel tracks, and we all need to come together and see where there's overlap and where we can build on each other's proposals. Our hope is that we will be able to have a written summary of these proposals to Eric and the rest of the state board staff by February 1st, so that we could then sit down. We would like to sit down with staff and just sort of see, are there things that we're missing in terms of what we put together before we develop the detailed cost information that's been discussed here, because we don't want to go to a lot of work to develop some detailed cost proposals only to find that what we think is not adversely affecting water quality, not necessary for compliance. If there's a different perspective among the staff on that, we'd prefer to know that before we go down the road of spending the effort on that. And then we also do want to talk with our colleagues in the MPDS larger group. So some of the more immediate opportunities that we have come up with, we have short-term and long-term proposals, the way I would characterize them. And our short-term proposals largely deal with monitoring and reporting, perhaps not surprisingly, as well as what I would consider some process-type recommendations. So the monitoring and reporting, I will say that most of our monitoring and reporting recommendations have been pioneered in one regional board or another. So it's really a matter of taking those and giving them greater life throughout the water board system. One of them, which is, this may seem obvious, but is where you have consistent compliance with a particular requirement, or you have monitoring that you do year in and year out that shows no detections of anything, we ought to be able to stop doing that or reduce the frequency of that. Another is what I would consider to be duplicative monitoring. For example, and this is something that evolves over time, where back in the days of primary treatment, you monitored for, total suspended solids, and then you get a recycling plant, and you're monitoring for turbidity. And do you really have to keep monitoring for all this stuff when it's one of them is going to tell you what you need to know? So things like that. So those we think are more short-term, maybe more, I don't want to say low-hanging fruit, but probably things where we ought to be able to come to some agreement, pretty easily quantify the costs. In addition, there are certain types of reports that are often required that to us leave us scratching our heads. For example, a salinity reduction plan when you are in compliance with your effluent limit and the salinity water quality objective seems to us to be something that maybe isn't the best use of your time. There are pollution prevention plans that are required for things like ammonia, and I don't know, you guys know about the wastewater process. I think you know where ammonia comes from. Doing a pollution prevention plan for it is not particularly meaningful. So things like that. In addition, on the process side, what we would be looking at are things like, there are many tools, I think Danny referenced some of these tools that are available both in the state water boards process and in EPAs, and we hear about them a lot when there are compliance challenges. You can do a water effects ratio, you can do a use attainability analysis, you can do a site-specific objective. And all of those processes exist, but our track record with using them is not particularly favorable. And so we think that one of the reasons is a lack of clarity about how you're supposed to do these things, what's required, what do you need to do in order to move forward with something like this. A lot of money is spent reinventing the wheel on these things. So one of the things that we're going to be teeing up is there some way to have more structure, more process, more guidance, something that would be more of a sort of a safer path for people who want to take on these types of things. So those are the kinds of things that we're developing and hope to have to bring to the staff on February 1st. All of these things have the potential to save significant amounts of money. Some in the millions of dollars if we do them right, and so we're very excited about that. And we do think that these things that we've just outlined certainly ought to pass the test of not having an adverse water quality impact. In fact, some of them could arguably have some other benefits like you've discussed. Then we're also looking at some long-term types of projects. For example, some changes in the way we do TMDLs and in particular some phasing proposals and things like that. So we do want to work those up. We realize those are things that won't be in place certainly by June, but perhaps we could have an agreement for an implementation process going forward. And so, as I said, we are encouraged by the effort. We're enthusiastic. I want to echo something that Danny said, where I feel that Eric and the staff have been properly prompting, but also sort of staying out of our way and letting us get together and have the kinds of conversations we have. While the MPDS community and certainly the POTW community are not as diverse as the ag community, we do have our differences, and so trying to figure out which of these things should go forward and do some of our own, as I said, screening of some of these proposals. But we feel that we are on track and are very much looking forward to the next round.
Thank you, Bobby. That sounds excellent. I would say, though, before you do too much screening, just because, you know, an idea is not perhaps, well, let's just put it this way. Out-the-box thinking and ideas are always welcome. It may not be something that we can do immediately. It may be something that gives staff the wheelies. It may be something that EPA may frown upon, but so what? I mean, the whole purpose of this is to try to be creative and get some of these efficiency solutions out on the table. So I look forward to perhaps seeing your, you know, rough draft on February 1st. And I would say if there is a recommendation or an idea that your group feels very strongly about, I wouldn't necessarily shelf it right away, but perhaps put it in the parking lot or something if there is a problem with moving it ahead. And, you know, perhaps you can have a discussion at the next update on some of those ideas. But thank you. That sounds very good, very promising, great work.
Great. Well, I appreciate that, and you know, we'll. I think what we'll try to do, taking that to heart, is to filter only for those things that we maybe can't get our hands around sufficiently to really make them meaningful, but not necessarily censoring ourselves on something that might be ambitious or might potentially not be embraced by the universe of people right away. And I do want to say that we did, I forgot to mention this earlier, we did come up with our own criteria to use internally, which is, you know, that reforms have to help more than one POTW. That quieted down a few people, but you know, not necessarily the whole state, right? If it has benefits throughout a region or a portion, you know, a certain category of discharger, for example, a freshwater dischargers, then we would do those things and take them on, but that we weren't really there to fix somebody's individual permit. So
That's really helpful. I see a lot of promise there in your groundwork to take good ideas in one area and forecast, if it were implemented statewide, what kind of savings would be possible. That seems like something that's within your grasp based on the information you have, and that could yield some real economic benefit. And then also, I really appreciate that idea that you could, out of this process, recommend specific guidance and activities that we, you know, our staff could look at in terms of our priorities and whether, you know, where that would fit in terms of statewide type guidance. That would be productive as well. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Barceau. I'm the Executive Director for CASQA and also the coordinator for the Stormwater Work Group. And I feel like you've heard a story about an apple this morning, an orange, let's say, and I feel like you're going to hear a whole different story now, a banana or pear or something, but just different, yeah. The Stormwater Work Group.
Stormwater exotic. Be a mango, Jeff.
A mango.
be a mango.
Papaya, something, yeah. The Stormwater Work Group has about 170 people on our email list. We've had 2 phone calls so far, conference calls that have been hosted by state board staff, one in early December, another one last week. I would say we probably had, you know, several tens of people on both those calls, very engaged discussion for a couple of hours each time. We've had people from the construction stormwater field, the industrial field, as well as the municipal field. So we've got quite a bit of breadth in that direction. And then the other dimension, we've got people who have individual permits. We have people who are under the general permits. We have people who are under sort of regional permits as well as area-wide permits. So we've got a lot of depth that way as well. So quite a bit of diversity, which I think reflects on what you're going to hear from me in terms of what we're coming up with, because it's not to the point where Bobby is talking about now and getting specifics. I've given you kind of a 2-pager progress update memo that you can kind of walk through here, and we'll be fleshing this out. This is very raw data. Essentially, this is very raw information. These are essentially bullet points from those 2 phone calls. We basically divided our work up into doing 2 things. First of all, identifying the cost drivers, the most significant cost drivers for stormwater permitting, and then thinking of ideas for how do we reduce the costs of those particularly high-level cost drivers. And these are not ordered in any particular way yet. They haven't been massaged or categorized or organized anyway. This is kind of just a loose list of ideas here. But obviously, TMDLs is one that comes quickly top of mind, top of the list as being one of the big cost drivers. And as TMDLs get adopted, those are showing up in permits more and more for stormwater agencies and driving their programs much more than they did 20 years ago when we had no TMDLs. You've heard already the information, the need to generate information, whether it's monitoring information or annual reporting, is another place where people spend a lot of time and money generating information. Another one we heard about was provisions that are beyond the purview of a particular jurisdiction or the control of stormwater permittee. This gets to the point of sometimes when you're complying with the TMDL for, say, pesticides, you can't regulate pesticides at the local level under statute. So then, but you still have a requirement to meet a pesticide TMDL. So that that becomes a very expensive task because you don't really have much control. So you're spending a lot of extra time and money cajoling others, working with others, trying to help them help you basically comply. We have some folks mentioning provisions that they feel are overlapping with other provisions from other regulatory agencies, and they wonder, do we need them in both places? Can we just have one provision that would satisfy multiple agencies' requirements? There are folks that feel like we have provisions in the permits that maybe they sort of have been grandfathered in. They're in there. They've been in there forever. They just kind of keep staying in the permits every single generation, and they wonder whether they're really we're ever really focused on water quality. But maybe they're recognizing now that maybe they're not really helping with water quality. At least we can't prove that they're helping with water quality. So why is that provision in there? People are getting pretty, I think, pretty scrutinizing about provisions these days because every provision has there's no slam dunk provision. There's no cost provision. So if you can remove even the simplest provisions, sometimes it can save you some money, and that's worthwhile. Hydro modification management appears to be another big cost driver area for cities and counties in particular. Permit fees are mentioned, of course, but I would say it's kind of a mixed bag there. Some people feel like permit fees is not the big issue. It's for them, compared to implementation costs, permit fees they're not happy about the increases, but they're also recognizing that in the big picture, they're not their biggest cost. Other smaller businesses, they might actually say, yeah, that's a pretty significant cost. That permit fee is maybe half as much as I'm spending for implementation because I have a simple facility or something like that. Of course, areas of special biological significance and state water quality protection areas are for those people that have those areas. Those demand a higher level of protection. That means more resources, and obviously that becomes a big cost driver. Interestingly enough, I'm sure you can imagine the receiving limitations language came up again. In this context, it was more like, well, we may be having to put money aside to fend off that lawsuit that we get or that notice to sue at some point. And so particularly cities and counties are feeling like to be a prudent agency, you need to prepare for the future, and it would be prudent to put money aside in case you ever do get a notice from somebody about that language. 7, remediation costs and permit channel maintenance were also mentioned. I think these were probably pretty specific to particular permittees and may not be ones that everybody is sharing. So as I say, these need to be sort of categorized, organized, and prioritized, and then I'll bring that back to you later on with a list. But this is just a quick listing for the ones that have coming forward. And then we sort of brainstormed for a couple of calls, ways to reduce those costs. And again, this is not necessarily organized any particular way. In seeing these, I do know that sometimes these ideas happen. I've seen them happen in some permits in the state, and other times I know that they're not happening. So we don't want to blanket some of these comments by saying that nobody's doing this or everybody's doing this. It's really kind of hit or miss. And maybe as Bobby was saying, we probably have examples where some of these good ideas are being implemented or have been implemented already. So maybe the job really is more about exporting that to other parts of the state as opposed to making it brand new. And in the stormwater, Eric Oppenheimer made this observation last week at the end of our last call that a lot of our comments in the stormwater group are more about process and approach to permit writing than they are about a specific provision that everybody has that we should just lose that provision kind of thing. That's not really coming up in these discussions. So there's an interest in, and I think it's really based on the fact that we had the stormwater permits for about the last 22 years, and people were thinking about how they were designed originally, what the thinking was there. It was based on a wastewater model, and as you've heard me say before, some of those approaches maybe aren't looking so good anymore. There's some warts on that model that don't quite match up with a non-point source like stormwater. So you're sort of seeing that come out in these discussions. But there's a general sense that I think it would be nice to move more towards permit design first rather than permit writing. There's a sense that sometimes we build these permits like a house without an architect and without a blueprint. You sort of have a general contractor and a bunch of subs, and the sub goes building the plumbing system, and they build the HVAC system. But there's no central plan for that permit. There's no central vision for what's this permit going to do for the next 5 years. Even more importantly, what's it not going to try and do the next 5 years? So you have some governors on what ends up in the permit, and it's a little more focused to what's in the permit. I've seen this happen before, so I'm not saying it happens all the time, but there are times when it seems like the permit just is just an amalgamation of the past and a bunch of new ideas from the future, but not necessarily pointed at any grand vision or any grand design. And people feel like it ends up being probably at best inefficient and sometimes wasteful as a result. Provisions that don't match up with each other, provisions that have you going separate ways at the same time. So more of a focus on permit design, and then start the writing once you have the grand design figured out, is kind of where that's coming from. There's also an interest in doing more review of the actual permit performance, looking back at the permit from 5 years ago, and saying, how did it perform? Was that provision, did it play out the way we thought it was going to play out, both for us as well as for the permit writers? And if not, let's think about that. We're not sure that always that the sort of introspective, retroactive review is done. I know it does happen, but I also know when at times it doesn't happen. Just what was in there before, we're just going to keep it. We're just going to put it in there again. We're not going to test to make sure that it still is written the right way or couldn't be modified some way. There's also a sense that if you had a stronger, more maybe a written down vision for the permit for the next 5 years, let's say, that you could then test the provisions against that design and say, are they on point with that overall approach to that permit for the next 5 years? If they're not, why is it in here, or why is it written in that way? And then you force people to write provisions in a way that, again, are pointed at the goal and are within those boundaries.
Good. This is, generally speaking, this makes a lot of sense. And then the next phase, are we going to then see some specific provisions and some specific?
Some of these specifics, I realize the challenge for us is going to be translating these great, grandiose concepts into, okay, so what would you actually change? And we're going to have some. I think I can tell you that we're not going to be able to do that for some of these things.
It's okay,
but for some things I think we probably can.
I want to encourage this in terms of looking back. We've been doing, in some cases, 22 years, and if there are some specific issues that have a cost associated with them that doesn't seem to be, making sense in terms of some kind of outcome, or to use Bobby's example, you're monitoring something over and over and you're not getting detects, and that doesn't seem to be a wise expenditure. That's the kind of critical analysis we're interested in. We really want to have the continuous improvement in these general provisions. So, I would just say, let's get more specific and talk about specific provisions that seem to be just being grandfathered in versus, what's the track record on this? How do we pivot and, refine that focus to what really makes a water quality difference?
Yeah.
Right.
And I think I would say that I think the hope and the sense is that if you wrote permits in this way, took a different approach to writing a stormwater permit this way, that the costs would almost automatically drop, or at least the efficiencies would almost automatically rise, because by not doing it this way, you end up with a lot of overlap and wastefulness and things that don't necessarily need to be there. It would just the efficiencies would just sort of drop out of the process. But there's definitely remaining interest in, there's concern that, that sometimes when you have a statewide requirement or general requirement, it doesn't apply to everybody in the state. Is there a way to customize those or modify those for local conditions? Very strong emphasis on the ability to prioritize, and I think the board in the last several years, not just this board but the other boards in the state, have recognized that prioritization, given the fact that nobody has any money and you're not going to be getting much more soon, that prioritization is really critical to managing a good program. You have to be able to prioritize and focus on your worst problems first. There's some concern that we have provisions in some permits that are not strictly related to that agency. That stormwater agency is not the lead for that issue. For example, we have some permits where they're talking about doing some work with water suppliers, and the permittee said, well, why don't you just go to the water supplier directly and ask them, put it in their permit. Why are you putting it in the stormwater permit and then asking us to lean on them? They're bigger than us. We don't have control over them. We understand it ends up in stormwater eventually, but in the meantime, they're really the person you should be talking to directly. So that sometimes happens. As you know, stormwater, everything ends up in stormwater. We often find ourselves on TNDL implementation, finding out that we don't control all the different inputs into stormwater. There's an interest in not in permits per se, but in implementation plans for TMDLs, that we name all the names of all the parties that might have some influence on this particular pollutant of concern. We did that, I know, on pesticides in the Bay Area. Our agency said, okay, stormwater agencies, here's our purview, here's what we can do locally. But we also recognize that that's not going to solve the problem, so we pointed fingers at DPR, at the ag commissioners, at EPA, at you all, and said, please do this little part here, and you do this little part here, and then collectively we can solve the problem. I think that's playing out pretty well. But oftentimes, I think people feel like they're often told, well, we have our permit with you, we don't have it with so-and-so, or we don't have much control over them, so you lean on so-and-so. And again, these programs are not very well funded. They're not separate districts, generally speaking, so they don't have a lot of power to influence others. There's an interest in focusing the permits more on water quality outcomes as opposed to just doing activities because we do activities, just because it was there before. There's an interest in sort of having the provisions prove themselves that they really are focused on water quality, and in our heart of hearts and minds of minds, we say to ourselves, yeah, that should be making a difference on water quality. If we can't say that to ourselves, maybe we shouldn't have it in there. Maybe it should be written differently. A very strong interest in not generating information that doesn't get used or read. And there's a sense that that has happened a lot, unfortunately, in the past. It's in the monitoring front, I sort of call it seance monitoring. We just collect a bunch of data, hold hands, and somehow the data will speak to us and tell us what the answer is. Well, it's probably not going to speak to us or give us the answer we were hoping for. So the sense is, be tough on ourselves and say, if you're going to ask me to monitor for something, what's the question you want me to answer? What's the management question? What's the monitoring objective? How are you actually going to use my bit of data to answer that question? Just plug it into your question when it's all said and done. Same thing with annual reporting as well. As I mentioned before, there's an interest in moving away from, the permits are still based on the Part 1, Part 2 application requirements in the federal regulations from 1990. Those were sort of theoretical. They said, well, what's the stormwater program supposed to look like? Industrial, construction, municipal. It was based on the wastewater experience from the last 100 years or so. We've got 22 years of stormwater experience now, and people are saying, well, some of the permit language is still kind of based on the permit application from 22 years ago. Some of that cannot be relevant anymore, or maybe it needs to be at least revised in some fashion. I'm sure you're aware of this one as well, moving from output-based results to outcome-based results, less bean counting, more focus on what did we actually accomplish, whether it's in the receiving water or in the storm drains themselves or going into the storm drains, but somewhere along that path from here to receiving water quality. Quite a bit of interest in promoting and allowing for coordination among permittees, and the watershed approaches, of course, is an example of that. And actually not so much just allowing for that, because if you can say, well, you can always get together and work on things together. Nobody's stopping you from, what the problem is, it takes more effort to do so. And so people need incentive to start down that path. It takes longer to meet your neighbor, talk to them about what's going on, work out some deals, all that kind of stuff takes a lot of effort. So if it isn't incentivized somehow, it's just allowed for, people say, well, I want to work with my friend, but I just can't afford to, frankly. I don't have the time or money to do so. But if the permit is written in a way that incentivizes that, provides a path of least resistance for that. For an example might be, in the Bay Area, we have a provision in our permit that says you will participate in some kind of regional monitoring program. And if you don't, you'll make up your own. Well, everybody sees the make up your own side as being more expensive and fraught with a lot more liability. So they all join the regional effort because it seems like there's less liability there, and it's more cost effective. And ultimately, it's probably a better program than one being done by an individual agency. So just that simple little incentive moves everybody in the other direction and helps them want to work, work together when they really do want to work together. There's an interest in moving away from sort of arbitrary permit requirements. We often see in a permit, you must visit every facility once every 5 years. And we say, why not once every 10, 20, every week, every 6 months? It's an arbitrary and capricious number that somebody made up thinking that sounded right, but there's no information behind that. We want to move towards a model that says, based on our experience, based on our understanding of that industry, what's the right frequency to visit, as opposed to just sort of making up numbers for the sake of making up numbers and then doing things that you're not sure really are the most important things to be doing. People made suggestions about best management practices. They want to make sure that we recognize that B&Ps have a sort of an optimum scale. Some things really have to be done locally. Some things really are statewide, like legislation or something like that. I was just reading the paper over the weekend that the UN environmental program, they just signed its mercury reduction program, for the whole world basically. And in our head, that's a BMP. It's a worldwide BMP that is going to reduce mercury emissions from Asia and the coal-fired plants there. They're drifting across the Pacific Ocean and ending up in San Francisco Bay. So we want to think expansively about the right scale for BMPs, and that's going to have a huge impact over time. Recognizing that BMP, we have a lot of challenges in BMP selection and stormwater because everybody thinks they know what the right BMP is. You've got to do lid, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. Sometimes they're right, oftentimes they're right, but not necessarily always. No BMP is the BMP every single time, every single place. There's no silver bullet. So the permits have to recognize that too. We get folks talking about making sure that we promote new technologies because we're still looking for the right tools for stormwater. And then I would say In difference with wastewater agencies, where I think the standard BMP is typically treatment is your line of first defense, very sophisticated treatment. Stormwater, I think we've learned, it's almost just the opposite. Your first line of defense is really true source control, pollution prevention, then sort of operational source control, and then, and not only then, if those two don't work or don't get you all the way there, then you might think about treatment or LID, those kinds of things. But LID is really more of a true source control. But yeah, I think we're recognizing that for a lot of our pollutants of concern, we're not going to treat ourselves out of those problems for stormwater because the volumes are too large, the concentrations are too low to make a difference there.
I just want to say that that's not limited to stormwater. And one of the proposals we'll be bringing forward is going to be how do you deal with those kinds of constituents that are in relatively de minimis quantities in POT effluents and are not easily treatable.
Yeah,
So,
you've gotten there too,
yeah. So pollution prevention may be our first go-to thing too in some cases.
And then, of course, multi-pollutant approaches. That's becoming very popular with the plethora of TMDLs we're getting adopted. People are realizing that if I put this BMP in today for pollutant X, and 2 years later I got to put another one in for pollutant Y, I could have done the same one maybe, or a bigger one. So they want to take multi-pollutant approaches, which means actually aligning schedules and locations for TMDLs and other requirements, just so they're on the same page, so they can think about those things all at the same time, as opposed to having to do it later on. In terms of costs and fees, there was interest in looking at your own costs and fees, and looking at phase 3. Thank you, Tam. Thank you very much. There's also interest in making sure there's a stormwater revenue spent on the stormwater program, and some interest in reducing permit fees or limiting fees if you have local programs that can sort of act in their stead. Kind of an interesting idea. We recognize we're going to have to do some studies. I think apparently there was a cost of compliance study done on the phase 2 permit, which we might be able to glean some stuff from that would, I know this is not focused on any particular permit, but there may be some approaches there or some ideas that we might be able to get more specific information to you on some of these bigger ideas. And there was interest in sharing the costs of doing studies with the state as well. In terms of potential actions, there was interest in creating a conceptual model of cost of compliance. I'm shaking my head as well. I heard it twice on the call. I'm not quite sure exactly what this is. I need to talk to the person that suggested what exactly. We asked them actually to come back with a sketch for us of what this model looks like, and we're hoping to see that. There's interest in pilot testing some things. I think there was somebody made a comment that we're not really able to experiment much in the stormwater permit, and we need to be able to experiment. We need to be able to do some things that are required under the permit so we can actually get support and funding for them locally, but that the results are not held against us if it doesn't pan out necessarily. Because otherwise we're not going to experiment, because we can't afford to just do it outside the permit. But if we can't do it in the permit, if we're going to be held to not coming up with the best results. So ideas like following SB 310, I think that was from the 2010 session, where you can do watershed management planning. Block grants was suggested. And then finally, the idea of sort of recreating the pre-treatment program on the stormwater side. There was an idea from the industrial facility folks about whether there was a way to transfer responsibility for permitting and regulating local businesses to the local agency, rather than having it come from the state. And I think the idea was that if it was done by the local agency knows their businesses better. They can maybe do some programs with them industry-wide within that region or within that watershed. I don't know if they were suggesting necessarily moving MPDS permitting authority from the state of California down to city X or Y, because I'm sure that's not possible. But again, out-of-the-box thinking is perfectly acceptable at this point. But there may be something else other than short of that maybe we can think about. I think that there was just some sense of the duplicative nature of doing the industrial permit and the construction permit, and then having local agencies also having programs seems somewhat, on the face it seems like it's kind of wasteful. And so is there a way to maybe move that down to local agencies if they wanted to take on that responsibility somehow?
You know, we laugh, but Jeff, I'm actually not opposed to that idea. It's just, how it's done.
Yeah, I had the similar reaction. I thought, well, that's intriguing.
The pre-treatment program has been very successful.
Yeah.
Well, and also, and just, an item we just discussed this month was the local oversight programs for underground tank cleanups. So, I'm not sure, John Bishop, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I am. And what's your sense of right now? The current status of this, it sort of depends on the local agency, but there's a certain amount of delegation, and then there's certain things that we don't delegate. Isn't that true?
I'm not sure, and I'd like to talk more, because what I've heard repeatedly is that's your permit requirement, don't make us enforce it. And so this is the opposite. I think what I'm hearing is, if you pay us to do it, we'd be happy to do it. Is that what?
Yeah, and we recognize this comment came from an industrial representative, not a municipality. And the municipalities, as you say, Jonathan, basically say, well, we need to get some funding to help implement that program. But I can see from the industrial perspective, what I'm hearing is they'd rather deal with the local agency. They deal with them on other things that are all at the same time. Maybe there's opportunities to synergize other requirements of household hazardous materials, other kinds of reasons for them being there. So yeah, I think there might be something there. We just need to explore it further.
Don't rule this one out.
No, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have the, the Coupa program that has been looking at multiple state requirements in the past. I just don't, we'd have to look into it more closely if the training was available for these inspectors, if they're already out there. I mean, that was the idea behind the industrial and construction requirements, some of the phase ones, is, well, these folks are already there. How do we leverage that? And so there may be somewhere to go with that. It's the devil will be in the details. How do we incentivize it without requiring it so that it doesn't become a burden, which is what we've heard repeatedly.
Which is why it's suggested as a pilot.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there's a lot of, good sense to that suggestion.
Yeah. So in terms of next steps, obviously we need to sort of flesh out these bullet points, categorize them, and organize them in some way. We're kind of envisioning some kind of a matrices that has, short-term things that could be done, long-term things that could be done, specific suggestions. We have mostly more systemic and systematic sort of things here right now. And then also, what are those things that we could do within the confines of the regulations as they are today? And what are the things that you'd have to change regulation for, have legislation for? Again, we've told everybody, be as expansive as you can in your thinking, recognizing that some of the stuff isn't going to be handled right away, but we don't want to lose those ideas either. We want to keep them for a long time. And then we're going to be sitting down with Eric and his staff and kind of screening those to see, whether they're within the bounds of the current regulations or not and moving forward. And then, as you say, Stephen, trying to turn those into real costs and real. And it may be more, I'm thinking it may be more relative costs, like this is a relatively more costly thing than this, or because the costing of the stormwater programs is hard to figure out. There was a study done by the state, or I think it was Office of Water Programs about 10 years ago now, where they went to several cities and counties, looked at their costs, and their costs tend to be buried in a bunch of different places within a city or a county, because again, they're not a special district, and it's not a single-use, single-purpose sort of agency. And so you can get the cost for one agency certainly, but then it becomes almost as anecdotal because you can't compare it to the next agency's cost really, or let alone statewide. So, but maybe we can certainly do some relative costing, I think, and we'll look at the phase 2 study as well to see what they were able to come up with in terms of specificity.
What's your time frame, Jeff? Obviously, Bobby is ahead of everyone with respect to her February 1st time frame. What is yours?
I think we met last week. I think we're just trying to move as fast as we can, basically, and it's sticking with the schedule that Eric has given us. But I can see us probably having at least several more meetings and discussions before we'd be ready to kind of provide something more formal and more digested to you at some point. Probably February sounds too soon to me, so I'm thinking more like March-ish or so, something like that.
Because based on Danny's recommendation of another check-in or another status update, I'm trying to plan ahead to see when the appropriate timing of that would be.
Yeah.
And so it sounds
March 5th is our first board meeting. I don't know.
March might be too early. Maybe the second meeting in March.
That would be the 19th. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right.
Seems like that might be okay.
But I don't know what else is on the schedule.
I mean, ideally for this next update item, I would want to hear of some very specific, or at least the semi-final list of recommendations and ideas that the groups are working on, as well as those that they've put perhaps in the parking lot to get feedback from the board. So 2nd March or 1st April meeting, I guess.
Okay.
I'm hearing 1st April meeting. Hopefully it won't be on April 1st.
It kind of depends on, it depends on what's on the agenda already.
The first April meeting is currently scheduled for April 9th, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Why don't we shoot for that? Okay. Thank
you.
you, Jeff.
Thank
Those
you.
are, you've got some great ideas here as well.
Yeah.
I think a lot of things, obviously, as you said, need to be fleshed out, but I think you've got a lot of good gems here that we can build upon, so thank you. And one of the things that I thought of when I saw the various groups and all the list of interested parties was, wow, Jeff has his handful. I think you have the largest group of about 140 plus people participating. So the fact that you've been able to get them to focus on some of these issues and outline them is excellent. Thank you very much.
Well, hopefully we'll keep focusing it and get something specific to you soon. So.
Yeah, that's good. I just wanted to give you a little feedback. One of the challenges on stormwater is just the breadth and diversity, and but it seems to me, and you can let me know if I'm off base here, but in some ways we can distill costs to the more programmatic, the reporting, the monitoring, the process information that you describe. But then also with stormwater, there's an infrastructure component, capital work or O&M work associated with maintaining infrastructure. And so I'm interested in bifurcating a little bit there because I believe, and I've spoken to this as a regional board member, the infrastructure renewal challenge includes stormwater infrastructure. And so where I'm coming from, having designed infrastructure renewal work myself, is there's a lot of costs that are coming up anyway, related to replacing curb and gutter, to be overly simple. And as those costs are faced by local governments in the stormwater program, there will be opportunities to piggyback water quality improvement infrastructure on stormwater infrastructure renewal projects. So how do we get to that in this exercise? I don't know. But, again, it's one of those things where it's not just a cost from 0 to X, but it's actually, Y plus X. There's already going to be costs incurred managing drainage in urban areas. Thank you.
That's good.
And I would just add that one thing to keep in mind, particularly around the synergies with other institutions, one of the real challenges on stormwater in particular is that we don't have a mechanism at this point to gather the information as to how much of that stormwater is actually going into a water supply benefit. And until we get that, it's very hard for a water supply agency or the state in terms of energy efficiency, climate issue credits, if you will. It's very hard for them to help pay for these things if they're not being quantified and used.
It's
and
hard,
so
hard to value.
that's something. It's not. There are barriers to getting cost sharing, and so put that on your list to talk about. What other barriers are there? I just know that there is that one, and it's big.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Emily Rooney. I'm with Agricultural Council of California, and I have a few slides. It's my understanding that we have them here. We think. Oh, great. Thanks. I'll wait a few minutes. Thank you. I am co-chairing the WDR subcommittee with Bob Gore of the Gualco Group, who's here on my left. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this project. We are looking forward to improving the compliance process, and I do think that this is a good opportunity for some meaningful reform in this process here. Let's see if I can get these. Hello.
Maybe have to put it up there so I can see this.
Yeah, maybe it's. No?
Scroll forward.
Oh, there we are. Okay. Our committee work, we have had one formal meeting at this point. That was on November 28th. And we have about 87 or so participants on our official stakeholder list. There's over 2,000 WDRs, so it's sort of a drop in the bucket in terms of folks that are participating. Our immediate outreach, myself and Bob's, is in food and ag, and my membership are small farmer-owned businesses to some of the world's best known brands, including food processing and that sort of thing. So I've been doing some additional outreach to others on the stakeholder list that are outside of agriculture. I am a little concerned that we might be a little too ag heavy, but we're working on that. We're still getting anecdotal information, even as recent as yesterday, from some of those other stakeholders. So we're still collecting data on cost, basically.
Emily, what other groups would you like to be involved and could we help in terms of outreach?
Well, I've put a lot of emails and phone calls out. I think I'm okay right now. There's a County of LA, somebody from the Navy, Fish and Game. I've had that feedback trickling in. I'm finding, even with my own membership, that a lot of them are still trying to figure out what their costs are and what the actions are, because a lot of them go through consultants. So there's a delay in getting that information to us.
Okay.
We also have several irrigation districts and
Introduce yourself. Yeah.
waste managers as well. I'm Bob Gore from the Gualco Group.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the offer stands.
Thank you, appreciate it. So what I tried to do is come up with sort of overarching themes of what we're hearing from our stakeholder group. The first one, if we simplify the process enough, staff can take a more targeted approach by looking at bad actors and encouraging technology while improving the environment. We're hearing that new technology requires new demand for studies, new permits, and increased costs when the underlying intent is to improve the environment. So how do we sort of help facilitate that? New regulations and revisions must be outcome-oriented versus process-based. We've heard that here today already. The compliance for this permit is immensely complex, and that seems to be the #1 challenge in getting lack of feedback from folks. There's individuals more than one individual that has stated to me that they think that this timeline to have something that's meaningful completed by June is unrealistic. I think it's ambitious, but anyway, there's just a lot of folks dragging feet because they don't know if they can get meaningful reform done by June.
Is that related? Sorry to interrupt, but is that related to the fact that you're projecting the potential costs of compliance versus going back in time and looking at existing WDR?
I haven't asked that specific question, but I do have one example of the dairy industry that has looked back in time, and we'll talk about those costs a little bit. So,
good.
And I'm still doing some digging on that, so I'm trying to pull folks out. And I just want to underscore this last point. Under no circumstances anybody asked for relaxation of environmental standards. Again, just to reiterate, most of it's paperwork, basically. Examples of excessive cost compliance, going back to the pie that was mentioned earlier, the biggest costs are probably with sampling and reporting, and then the creation of the annual report. The sampling is completed monthly, quarterly, and annually. Then there's creation of plans, there's nutrient management plans, waste management plans. There's a creation of an annual report, and I'm going to leave an example of a study for the dairy industry that CDFA performed. I'm going to leave that with the board members and with their staff. There was a study completed in 2010, and it goes through the costs of compliance for dairies on the WDRs. And basically what it comes down to is it's a $15,000 cost per 1,000 cow dairy. And basically, I'll just tick off some of the items. On page 6 of the report, which you'll see, there's a box that outlines all the items required for the annual report. There's 3 sections. There's a general section, a groundwater reporting section, and then a stormwater monitoring results section. And in the general section, there's 15 required items. I'll go through the first 5 for time's sake. They want information on crops harvested, an annual dairy facility assessment, number and types of animals, whether in open confinement or housed under roof, estimated amount of total manure and processed wastewater generated by the facility, estimated amount of total manure and processed wastewater applied with calculations of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and total salt content. And those types of data requirements are sprinkled through just that first section, and a lot of them have this additional requirement for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and total salt content. So there's probably actually like 22 or so requirements just in that first piece, and then that doesn't even get really to the lab results, which are in Part B and C. So it's a very extensive annual report, and it could probably be revamped in a way where it becomes a more useful management tool for dairies, for environmental management, as opposed to just getting paperwork and data into the board. So going back to the cost piece, though, while it costs, according to CDFA, approximately $15,000 per 1,000 cow dairy, my food processors are telling me that it's roughly about $200,000 to $300,000 annually to comply with this process. And I'm in the process of, I've pushed back with them, trying to get them to bring me the actual data. So
I'm sorry, Emily, is that just the reporting?
that's my understanding. That's my understanding. So. But again, I've pushed back. This includes the cost of consultants too, so it's not just the paperwork. So those the consultants obviously have a hefty fee as well. So again, but that's just anecdotal information, and I'm hoping to document that. The goal is to have all this done by June. Let's see here. Let's see. Next slide. Outstanding issues for the existing regulations. Again, the annual report's not useful. I'm hoping that the stakeholder community can work with the water board staff to come up with a more environmental management type of tool, so that you know, a regulated entity doesn't have to hire a consultant to fill out the paperwork and then hire the same consultant to come up with another route to have sort of to achieve the outcomes that are desired. Because right now it's sort of two approaches that are going on. So that's probably one of the first things. You know, enforcement actions, again, should be focused on improving the environment as opposed to paperwork violations. And then this is a question that has come up through the stakeholder process. You know, if there's certain plans that are met or created and the standards for these reports are met, are there additional requirements necessary for the purpose of the law? And what are the benefits provided by the other reports? So it's just taking sort of a comprehensive look at the various reports and sort of, you know, are they meaningful? What are they addressing? And if not, is there something else we should be looking at? Here's a handful of suggested changes that we have here. For industries that do not have representative sampling programs, you know, we could create them on an industry-wide basis or by watershed, depending on sort of the situation. Again, there's no silver bullet, sort of depends on what's going on in the region. That way we can be more strategic in frequency and location of samplings. Again, going back to the annual report, create it more as a tool for environmental management. Maybe we can do some spot checks with self-monitoring for purposes of data collection. You know, and then field trips, you know, going back to one of Danny's earlier points about staff gaining a better understanding of, you know, the issues and the existing and emerging technologies. I know that we have a few sacrificial lambs that probably be more than happy to host some staff so that they have a better understanding of what's going out in the field, what's going on out in the field, so that there's a more meaningful relationship there. Again, the ombudsman, you know, and having somebody that understands the coexisting regulations and other things that are going on in other agencies, and so there's more of a comprehensive look at these regulations probably makes sense. And then an electronic permitting process. This would be pretty useful for new permits specifically, so folks know where their permit process is in the approval process, and that would be helpful there as well.
Before you move on, Emily, let me ask Karen. This idea about field trips for staff, I know that we have is it called the Water Academy?
The Training Academy.
The Training
correct.
Academy. Well, the Air Board has an Air Academy, so. Does the Training Academy have a process in place where they would work with members of the regulated community to arrange for some channels of communication and education?
Internships.
Well, not quite. I mean, I know that the Training Academy arranges for, you know, people to come and speak and provide courses to staff, but have we considered or have we had any sort of speakers, say, like from the various regulatory community, come in to present certain information or conduct tours or something like what Emily is suggesting here?
For a number of the classes, many of the classes do bring in members of the regulated community, members of NGO, et cetera, as a part of the classroom experience. To my knowledge, the training that is conducted for the Training Academy has limited, although there is some field trip experience, and both in the water quality and the water rights area, but not necessarily of the caliber that Emily is talking about. And I think the Training Academy and Margie Young's in particular could work with those individuals representing broader categories of regulation to arrange that kind of experience. And I would be happy to connect Margie and Emily. And Eric's sitting back there as well, and I'm sure he could convene that meeting too.
Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to that. I wrote it in my notes. So going on to next steps, you know, again, we're trying to document the compliance costs for industries and regions that are not already documented. Again, I'm going back to my membership, and then others that I've been getting this information from tangentially. We want to suggest strategies for representative sampling and improved sampling strategies in other areas for those groups that do not have that already. We have this issue with, you know, there's sort of this immediate burden of the regulation itself, and people seem to be focused on that, and it's just, you know, it's the sampling and the paperwork and all of that sort of stuff, I guess. And so we're having a hard time looking at longer term solutions because there seems to be so much in our face right now, I think. So that's going to be a charge of ours, obviously, and hopefully we can get to that. But that may be a longer term solution to find longer term solutions. Anyway, and then we want to be able to reevaluate the fee structure so that it's consistent with the workload once the changes are implemented. I think that's part of phase 3 that we've spoken about earlier here this morning. And we strongly would support an implementation plan and a check back in the April 9th meeting as well. And just if there's anything else that Bob may want to add.
Well, as a former journalist, I'll do 5 quick headlines. I'm Bob Gore from the Gualco Group. And this is what we're hearing from our stakeholders, and I've taken care to review the stakeholder remarks from those who are not ag. So this is additional input for you to frame the issue as we proceed. One is incent innovation for environmental protection. There aren't enough incentives in terms of staff encouragement. The second thought is, and I'm stealing here from Paul Martin, outcomes, not process. The third is participate in Cal EPA's permit consolidation exercise that's about to begin. And the fourth is removing redundancy and in terms of both regulations and interagency requirements. And the last is customer-based budgeting and zero-based permitting.
So I'm going to show my ignorance here. What is Cal EPA's upcoming permit consolidation process?
When the director of the governor's office of business and economic development presented to the Board of Agriculture earlier this month, he mentioned that Cal EPA's departments have gotten together under a 1995 statute to do an exercise for consolidated permitting, and they're about ready to select 2 or 3 pilot permits.
Tom? The things we learned.
Yes.
Yes, well, me as well. So we'll certainly check into it, but I haven't heard about it.
Thank you, Bob. That was very intriguing.
You're welcome.
Oh, now I get to show my ignorance. No, on waste discharge requirements, it's a broad area, right? And you know, are we? And then staff, please chime in. But we're not trying to narrow this at all. We have, you know, in our report, resource alignment, we really include things like the landfill WDRs and community septic system WDRs with no so. And so, do you feel confident you've hit, you know, the full range that they're affected?
Not at this point, no, and that gets back to my earlier comments. Not at this point.
Good, because they have their own, you know, the landfill group. I mean, the regions have their own sets of requirements, but again, it relates to other